though. Okay, so for today's talk, I'm going to be jumping between a lot of different disciplines. And there is an interdisciplinary trajectory through all of them. But instead of keeping it cohesively understandable, sometimes it becomes specialized. So I will be traversing computer science, interaction design, philosophy, and so forth. Oh, my slides are visible too. There we go. So at times, the language might be, or the concepts might be far within a special field, but then you each could take your own slice of understanding, and it would be a little bit kaleidoscopic. So I will jump around, and you could stitch it together. I will start my talk. So to go back, the talk will, I will focus in a part of my career where I've been transporting for the past 10 years or so insights from investigative arts to surgical sciences. So I won't be showing like most of my works, but just the ones that are relevant to this dialogue, and one that's also been part of the background of how the work that's been exhibited currently, Acophonia, is also involved in. So I do go to, when I work with surgical sciences, it's not metaphorical or conceptual, but it's actually scientific inquiry leading to inventions, patents, and it's being used in real world. And often I have to talk to scientists to pitch ideas, which at first 10 years ago I was like a philosophical artist, but then it took time for my ideas to be accepted in the field. And this is how I usually start my talks to scientists arguing for a mode of sonic interaction design that's based in an interdisciplinary embodied understanding of how this field could be created in a way that's addressing some gaps in the field. So imagine you're walking in a forest with your friend, and there is, let's say, a radio playing quietly, stuck between two channels, let's say Led Zeppelin and Justin Bieber, and you could hear a bit of each song, and your friend's telling you a story. You're walking, you're hearing like a river, and you can hear the river approaching, and you can hear wind breezing through the leaves, and meanwhile, you're listening to your friend, you're aware of the ground underneath you, and the texture of the leaves to give you safety in your body of where you're walking and stabilizing. And suddenly, as you're walking, you hear in the murmur and shimmering of the leaves a sound that's far too spatialized to be just wind. So while you're listening to your friend, your ear immediately zooms in and starts listening. And because your body's kind of worried for a second, being like, is that a dangerous thing? But then it zooms in and finds that there is a sound of something moving really fast at a certain speed, and maybe concludes that, oh, it's perhaps a squirrel on a branch. And while you did that, which probably took like 1 second, you were still listening to your friend's story, and then now you know that you've approached the river. So that's a lot of stuff that's happening in the field of oral perception. And so that's the kind of insight that I've been trying to port into surgical sciences, because the field of sonic interaction design within surgical sciences doesn't have this kind of transparent, embodiable, non-invasive, and easily to integrate modes of sonic information. Often what's relied upon is representational technologies that like require the surgeon to think, this frequency means that means this. So how can we go back to this intuitive mode of audial diagnosis? Now, within the arts, we often work with this sort of fully multimodal modes of interaction, allowing people to use their senses holistically to balance themselves by bringing all sorts of materialities and modes of perception together. So I was coming from this kind of world into the surgical sciences. So now that we have a bit of a background, I will go to where I'm coming from. So I perhaps align myself historically with alchemists, early alchemists, and um, investigative artists. So for example, we have here a person holding an Ouroboros. And, no, the microphone's good. So for the early alchemists, modes of working with nature and technology and chemistry and all sorts of realms that we've now separated into different disciplines was not just about doing the thing that it was apparent on the surface, but it was an ethos of transporting insights and ways of living with one another. For example, of capturing nature's recursive, self-generative properties to fight against forces you want to hide yourself from. So meanwhile, it seemed like people were making gold. Then we have investigative artists coming from this tradition like Da Vinci, studying obsessively turbulent patterning, drawing for years what happens when you put a stone blocking the passage of water, and etc. And it turns out that Da Vinci actually produced the world's first, what we could call now scientific drawings of turbulent patterning that are accurate with current. If you look into this, you will see this being published and discussed a lot. But why was he doing this so obsessively? Similar to here, so there was a hidden goal. He wanted to find the movement of life itself, nature's patterning and form-giving tendencies, so he could imbue his works with it. So later, these kind of patternings are what you see in people's hair curling. And that's how the paintings come to life, because they have knowledge transported from movement of life, ported into something else. So currently, let's say one of the current contemporary branches of alchemy and investigative arts would be art science, where a lot of people in this field are trying to bring all sorts of modes of understanding together to create forms of knowledge that are not stuck with European modernization's effect on disciplinary thought. And I've done this sort of art science work in the context of my co-directorship at the Topological Media Lab for the past 10 years, along with choreographer, media artist Michael Montanaro, who's also a co-author of the work that's been exhibited, and David Morris, phenomenologist of science. And there we go back and forth between theory, art, practice, art as a way of innovating, of ways of living with one another and being with one another, and techne, not just as technology, but for inventing collective forms of improvisation and skillful play, and theory and concepts and philosophy for imagining potential futures. And we create these sort of multi-dimensional compositions where people could come together, where we could investigate difficult questions with no clear answers of how do we create a collective gesture? How can we sense dynamics without assuming what a body is, yet allow a body to improvise? So this sort of thinking, at least for us, has required a kind of a holistic shift from object-oriented way of thinking to fields of matter in process, or to moving from objectivity and measurement to phenomenologically situated forms of knowledge, understanding measurement itself as a form of performance and making this performance apparent to the senses, so then the imprints that this performance apparatus imprints into the process remains accountable to our senses, for example. Or instead of interfaces, we work with stuff of the world, or instead of working as encoding information into fixed media, we try to look of how we could inform transductive dynamics of formation, working with form-giving tendencies of nature itself and co-articulating it. My favorite move is moving from the phrase "I am, therefore I exist" to something is doing, which is Brian Masumi's rereading of William James and Whitehead. Because once you are, and you assume you are, then it's you versus the world, and then you have this whole gap to fill. You're like, all right, so how did I come to be? What is the world? Is our brain a computer, or is it a mirror? So we've already assumed too much, and we get into these logical loopholes. Whereas when something is doing is the basis, ontological basis of where we start our thought with, then perhaps we're a whirlpool. As we find ourselves being formed, we realize that we're bringing part of the world within us. So this is all really philosophical, but it's the backbone of a way of thinking that has allowed me to work across arts and sciences. So I'll get less philosophical and more contextually oriented in this kind of topic to tell you a little bit personally how I ended up at this intersection of investigative sonic arts and surgical sonic interaction design. I started with as a typical teenager, improvising and playing music, playing with instruments, and slowly moving to technologies. But what I understood after a while was that with material sonic technologies, such as the guitar, immediately if I scratch my nail across the guitar string, and this is I don't know, 30 years ago I had this realization, the guitar string suddenly was a score for my texture of the nail to perform. So suddenly the notion of who's the composer, who's the performer, what is the score, all of these were emerging. Whereas technologies were of representation that often try to make things binary, right or wrong, easy to understand, always far too musical, were not allowing for these sort of things to emerge. Then, in conversation with some colleagues in the field of in the field of surgical augmented reality and biomedical augmented reality procedures, I realized similar tensions existed, and I tried this myself. So, experienced surgeons really like to work with their hands because there's an immediacy where these notions like the guitar string could be used and abused, and you could get access to the thing you're trying to mediate. Whereas once you go to, let's say, a Da Vinci machine, you're performing on something that's somewhere else, and you don't have haptic control over it, and you're trying to fill the gap, and you're relying on the technology to tell you left, right, good, bad, and that doesn't really help. Or in terms of eye surgery, you have to look somewhere else to know if your trajectory has been aligned or misaligned. So I realized, okay, there's these tensions across two disparate fields that perhaps we could transport insight from the arts into surgical sciences. Some of the insights are ontological, as we learned from the string and other notions, like our augmented reality designs shouldn't overly distinguish between what is signal or noise, or what is performer, what is performed, or what is indeterminate, what is determinate. These kind of things could be allowed to arise in the notion, yet things need to be reliable, easy to cognitively integrate, and we need high accuracy, low latency, high resolution, otherwise the concert's gonna suck. It's the same for surgical sciences. So you need to surf indeterminacy, yet you need technologies to be reliant. Another insight was, I always try to, as I was saying, create a balance between surfing indeterminacy and then having some sort of a deterministic execution of something. And sometimes you need to work with far too human notions of time, so you know how things might unfold, like for example, the course of a surgery or the meal you're gonna cook. But things don't go on plan, and then things have their own temporal dynamics that you need to work with. So you need to kind of create a balance between design and contingency. Another insight, and this came from years of working with scientists, not to generalize the notion of scientists, it's the same for artists, in fact. The notion of the question is really important. So, especially within engineering sciences, to be precise here, there's a rush to answer the question, find a problem and answer it. But then there's millions of dollars, a big team, but then within investigative arts, the question is the question. Or within social sciences, we have the notion of wicked problems, whereas defining the problem is a form of negotiation. So we shouldn't jump into quickly defining our question, but our questions themselves are metaphors for bringing disciplines together. So for example, how can we place the surgeon's ear at the tip of their tool? That's very different than how can we spatially encode this and this in that kind of Cartesian space. It's a more ambiguous question, but then the more you look at the question over the years, I'm like, oh, the question is maybe weird. So my favorite mentor told me that at the beginning of an investigative journey, you have a question, at the end you have a better question. But these kind of question and motivations are driven through this vision-driven modes of poiesis and design, which I've heard like Hirishi Ishii of MIT Media Lab also talks about this. That's very different than technology and industry-driven design. For example, a Kinect or some sort of a algorithm that everyone might want to find a use for, or problem-driven design, like how do we improve the accuracy of traffic lights or such. Whereas vision-driven design becomes a form of conversation in public, it's been like, all right, what kind of future do we want to imagine we want to live in? So it's a form of negotiating our collective futures, or sometimes of having an imprint with something that might not seem possible, but we're aiming towards. So I have many visions and questions and themes, but one of the themes that runs through at least this talk and some of my works is imagining a post-schizophonic world. So a schizophone is when a sound is separated from its source. At the birth of sound recording history, you would speak, and then your voice would get etched in a wax cylinder. And then later you could reproduce it. And within electroacoustic technologies, that was quite enabling. It is enabling because now you could do all sorts of stuff with it. Cinema studies is very aware of this kind of realm, because once you've separated the sound from its source and you put it back in the world, the brain's trying to bind it to a source. Movie directors constantly think about where is the sound coming from? Why is it coming from there? What could it be? In the realm of sonic interaction design, that's rarely the case. Often you hear sound and it's there, but there needs to be more thinking. But if you want to do this in real time, then we need to think about how the world itself, the mattering of stuff, activity unfolding, how is that a post-schizophonic theater? And that's something I've been asking for a long time, trying to think, okay, once we have a schizophone, a sound separated from its source, we could, using computational technologies, reattach it to event dynamics through interaction design and re-embody sounds and allow people's imagination to bind it to new tendencies through poetics or instinct. So the role of a sonic interaction composer isn't to create sounds, but it's to create the experiential event in which sounds take place. I started this kind of journey with by getting into the stuff of vibrations. This is very different than the sort of technology that you see that you could like touch your hand and it triggers a sound sample. And whereas here, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to preserve as much noise before it becomes information, let's say, as possible at 48 samples per second, 48,000 samples per second. So, but yet apply machine learning to it to transform this real-time transduction. So that's how the pinecone, each pinecone was a different note, because as soon as I would touch it, the algorithm would be like, it's been touched like this, change that. Yet, if I decided to scratch my nail against the pinecone, suddenly the surface of the pinecone would become a score again for my nail to interpret, because I hadn't reduced the richness of reality to my idea of it. So this zone in the temporal zone of sounds from like years to immediacy to one sample or 1 millisecond, the zone between around like 3, 4, 5 milliseconds to 100 milliseconds, the zone between, let's say, emergence of timbre and rhythm and the conversions of each to the other is the hot zone for where there's a lot of information that could be encoded with minimum cognitive workloads. Like, let me see, I found in the back room this covering the oranges. So we'll go on this one. So right here, when I scratch this, oh. Seems mundane, but there was a lot of information in there. And one could train their ear to notice all the microtemporal patterns instead of reducing it to good, bad, too fast, too slow. And that's what those kind of preserving the richness of acoustic signals is about, to allowing those kind of micro nuances of information not to die out. So I transported these kind of technologies first, not first, but one of for interactive scenographies. So here we have Tony Chung, dancer and chef, who's cooking a meal, but through a contact mic on the table, all sorts of haptic acoustic interactions through the same algorithm that I showed you with the eggplant and the pine cone are turned into a gong. But depending on how he touches the surface, the gong pitch shifts. So it's as if the responsiveness of the gong itself is immediately transforming depending on how you touch it. So it's as if how you land on a trampoline is changing the trampoline on which then you have a response on. So it's kind of like a hyper acoustics. And that led to this kind of punk rock sonic aesthetic in this case. Okay, so then in a sudden, so I took this kind of same kind of technology into the realm of eye surgeries where you're trying to peel an eye, you're not trying to peel an eye. It's not Halloween yet. You're trying to peel that very thin surface on the top where it's like almost the thinnest kind of tape you have. And it's really hard to grab. There's really rarely any haptic feedback, so you're relying on like a screen telling you how much deformation you've had if you're applying too much pressure. But as you're trying to do this, you're trying to look somewhere else, and it's messy cognitively. So it's not the doctor's fault that they're not a good surgeons, it's just bad design. So we need to fix that kind of thing. I will go faster towards this part, but so we passed this kind of thinking through the scientific methodology, so to speak, to try to see if we could transport pressure and angle and all sorts of parameters into sounds. So then you no longer have to look at a screen, but you could, the same way I was ripping this, remember? So you could listen to something like that and then know if you're on the right track or not. Of course, surgeons at first and surgical scientists wanted something that was like musical, like a orchestra glorifying their actions. And then I was like, oh, listen to the sound of paper. And then that's what I mean of, at first, I was like a philosophical artist. But then I think this paper was a turning point because we passed this through the whole bunch of procedures, which for the benefit of time I'll skip. But this gets interesting. So what returned was that in all sorts of, like in temporal error, accuracy, localization accuracy, all of these were better through sonification than even when you combined it with visualization. This was really surprising. So the scientific community immediately responded to this, and they were like, okay, there's something here. And through the award, there was a stamp of legitimacy in there. Since then, I've been kind of campaigning for a biomedical sonification in a way that we could preserve all these fields coming together instead of turning it into an engineering problem, because it's not an engineering problem. How can you answer how you put a surgeon's ear at the tip of their tool through, how do you convert that to a formula? You shouldn't, because perhaps all sorts of fields should come together, and each of these fields are universes on their own, you know? So that takes us to the notion of sonification. And currently, in the past 10 years, there's been lots of debates and attempts to legitimize it scientifically. And that often goes towards like longer and longer descriptions. Yet in the arts, we have like Alvin Lucia sonifying his brainwaves already in 1965, while the first definition of scientifically emerged in 1999. Now, despite all these different definitions, my favorite is this simple one of just sonification is use of sound to convey information, because this is putting the focus on information. The word information becomes key instead of adding all these other things. Information has many definitions. One that I find quite useful is Gregory Bateson's cybernetician's definition, saying information is a difference that makes a difference. Of course, Simondon's definition is also excellent, but goes beyond this talk. This is really good because the difference that makes a difference is a non-anthropocentric notion. So it's not necessarily a human that needs to make a difference to, but also within the field of surgical sciences, it puts a bit of stress on the perceptual context. So the sounds I was making with this would mean nothing. So, but once you know the texture of this, and you know I'm moving it, then when you listen to its ripping sound, you can infer at what trajectory, perhaps with a bit of training, and what speed I was ripping this. And so here is a surgery. I dimmed it so it's not grotesque. It's a 5-second video of one of the surgeons I worked with, Dr. Mazda Farshad in Bulgaris University Hospital in Zurich, during a spinal fluid surgery, putting a screw in the spine for alignment. Often there's over-screwing which could cause to cracking. And here he screws it and he says, "Can you hear that?" No one else in the room can hear it, but he's hearing it because it's a difference that makes a difference for him. When I thought about it, I thought he's probably not even hearing it. He's haptic acoustically listening something. Yet surgical augmented reality often reduces these information-rich transductive zones of exchange to good, bad, too much, but that's too late because by the time we've transformed noise into signal, what was interesting is lost. Oh.
You hear that?
Yeah, so there we go. Now, going back a little bit to the arts. So, working with this sort of thinking, I'd like to co-articulate movement using sonification of event dynamics while preserving as much information as possible. That means, and you don't have to read, there might be too much on the screen, but that means working with modes of sound synthesis that are in the microsound domain of acoustic quanta that could be morphed, so you could work with information at that level where audible hearing is optimized for. So here's, for example, a dance piece I worked on with Akiko Kitamura where there's camera tracking and she's moving. So first of all, try to use non-anthropocentric tracking. Even though I'm working with a human, that means that I tried not to assume what a body is because that's already an ethical notion. So instead of like tracking a skeleton, I try to track expansion, contraction, vorticity, fields of activity. And that allowed her as a dancer to not ever turn her body as a puppet for technology, being like, if I do this, that happens. Instead, she was just feeling it and embodying it. That takes us to these intuitive notions of working with technologies. So just a minute. I didn't make the video for this talk, so this was for grant applications. This was there's all the quotes on it. Okay, so right now in that case, we had within the real-time sounds, the movements, forms of movement and activity were kind of acting like a form, let's say a temporal form that the sound would provide the filling for, so then time is the medium. So later on, currently I'm trying to work on modes where I can do that, but then yet have some sort of a macro structure. And for that, I used the factor oracle, which was an algorithm at first used for detecting similarity patterns between DNA streams, but instead it's detecting similarity patterns within sonic streams. And it's allowed, by doing that, you could give it a lot of content. Like in this case, I put into a computer a bunch of samples of Nina Simone playing the piano, and the algorithms stitching continuities between them while a sensor on a serial is filling the, creating a forming around movement, and the software is filling it with sonic form, going back and forth and jumping between different energetic zones depending on the form of movement. So what you hear is just my phone recording, and there's no score or anyone touching the computer. It's just this kind of put into play. So here's the same algorithm that is, instead of movement, is listening to, is used for musical improvisation. So in this case, in this very, very short 30-second sample that would you hear, the computer is learning the style of someone improvising Code Cook. So there was a moment in improvisation where there was just a phrase that perceptually was signaling me that now we're starting from scratch. So I emptied the memory of the computer learning the style of what's being played, and immediately the computer starts analyzing segments of sound coming in and perceptually tagging it, and then reimagining different combinations and then mapping them to a player piano and mapping it to spatialized sound around the venue. So, having worked with acoustic sensing, listening, machine listening, stitching, continuity patterns, distinguishing between all sorts of timbres, now trying to transport those technologies, not now in 2016, into reimagining a post-schizophonic world. So in Acophonia, I won't explain the work much because there's an exhibition, you could see it and read the description, but basically you speak into an Edison horn and your voice comes out as liquid and gets sonoalchemically processed, in this case like words to phonemes to silence, or boiling to extract spectral voice and phonetic vapor. Now, to imagine this kind of post-schizophonic world, I was trying to transport all sorts of insights, especially from philosophical biology, to move away from technologies that are like, here's an action, sense it, here's a sample, play it, action, response. Whereas what we learn through rigorous forms of biology is that action and response happen structurally. So that's not me claiming that I've made something that's alive, but it's more transporting insight between different fields to create modes of interaction that are better for co-articulation of emergence of form. I will not play the video. So a particular interest is to this talk is a module in the center of the piece that takes whatever people have given to the spoken into the horn, which comes out as liquid, and then you have words that are coming out and then broken into tinier droplets and then breaking into phonemes and acoustic quanta of silence. This was an obsessive journey to try to separate the acoustic signature of each water droplet, breaking into two and retaining its acoustic signature and correlating it with voices that were contributed, and so that the manner of the falling of each voice was as if it was your voice that had given it. I have to ask, I realize I'm almost out of time. Should I wrap it up quickly, or how much time should I have? Okay. All right, so maybe at least I'll take this point home. So that required applying acoustic sensing to and machine listening on structural vibrations that were dropping, and things that are minute that human ear might not be able to hear, like the manner of a water dropping through machine listening, has very specific acoustic signatures. And these acoustic signatures could be used to be correlated with people's voices that were spoken, who were also analyzed, and then if you correlate that, each water droplet could be the closest one that's close to how people spoke, and that was broken into segments. Okay, and this sort of technology at first was used on a cutting board for the piece, in the same piece that I showed before, where the performer, if they're touching the table, for example, with a tip of a knife and they're scratching the table, or if they're hitting the cutting board with the tip of the knife versus scratching, this would have a different acoustic signature, all these nuances. And I could have a bank of sounds that have like grains of sound, let's say a pizzicati or drum and bass, and each snippet of sound could also have an acoustic signature. And if you stitch this together in real time at the level of 5 milliseconds, what you get is this temporal continuity that allows someone to perform continuous forms of improvisation with. So, and that's the kind of technology that's at the heart of Acophonia. So when you go to see the exhibition, when you see the water droplets falling, that's exactly what was used. And this technology was then taken to surgical sciences again, and used for acoustic sensing, for example, in the spinal fusion that we showed you before, or in the stem insertion surgery, where if you're doing a hip replacement, they need to place one of these inside your hip and a joint that turns around. But what I learned was that when they do this, often even the most experienced surgeons could overhammer, and that could fracture where this is in your bones, and that creates complications and trauma. And this is the moment where I discovered, I asked the nurse and I was like, how often does this happen? And she said 70% of the time. So that's when I realized, okay, maybe we could use acoustic sensing and machine listening to provide feedback for that. So by simply placing a contact mic through machine listening, you could get the acoustic signature of something that's being overhammered, because when you have less air in something or more air, you got different acoustic signatures, like, right? That's different amounts of air. Yet in this case, it's not a perceptual hearing, or human perception is not enough to distinguish, but through a contact mic, we could distinguish that, preserving the richness of information and turning it into sound. So that wraps up, as you see acophonia, you could also think about how it's in far and wacky places that are unexpected. I will leave the talk here.